This is a Classic Hits 4FM podcast.
But first, a new political party has been set up in the UK called Justice for Boys and Men. It is an anti-feminist party, and the leader of the party is a man called Mike Buchanan. Now, I'll be speaking to Mike in a couple of minutes' time, but before I do, let me just give you a quick idea what the party is all about. Justice for Men and Boys is an anti-feminist party. Mike set this party up because he believes the state is very anti-men. And by the way, not just the state, we're feeling it here in Ireland as well, I have to be honest. This kind of extreme feminism, or some people call it feminazis. Mike quit the Tory party, should I say, back in 2009. The reason he quit was because David Cameron insisted on an all-women candidate shortlist. And of course, we've had that here in Ireland as well with our recent 30% gender quotas for women. He doesn't agree that women should be in politics just because of their gender. And he's probably right. Nobody should be in politics because of their gender. You know, I would hate to think that somebody would get a job just because they're a man or a woman. Since then, he has applied himself to promoting anti-feminism and has written a book on the subject as well. He believes feminists are vile. He also believes that modern society at all levels is dominated utterly by women, leaving men nothing more than a cowering, persecuted and powerless minority. He believes his party is dedicated to the rights of men, and tonight I want to know if you think there is anything wrong with that. I mean, Mike has stated in the past that he believes fatherhood is being systematically removed from society. He is quite passionate about the father's rights and believes that women are favoured more than men. And we've seen lots of that in the family law courts in this country, where women are favoured. In 93% of cases recently, in a report in the paper, women are favoured in the law courts here and on the family law courts. And I have to say, I do agree with him in relation to that. The family law courts in Ireland are a disgrace. They really, really are. I mean, men are being accused of all sorts of things, stepping before a judge where the woman is favoured automatically. Some people say that's right, they should be, because women have maternal instincts, etc., etc., etc. Well, if they do have these wonderful maternal instincts, then why are women claiming they're the same as men? Because they're clearly not, as far as the family law courts is concerned. It's a very complicated argument, but we'll get to it very shortly. But then we have the other side of the coin as well, where feminists will claim that women are being objectified. For example, we spoke 2 weeks ago about page 3 in The Sun, about models in newspapers. We see the girl draped across the bonnet of a car, and they claim that women are being objectified, and it's time for this to stop. So the question I want to ask you tonight is, do you support Mike's campaign? Do you believe we should have a party over here? A political party, essentially, that could be followed by men. In other words, standing up for men's rights. Or do you believe that men have enough rights and it's women who need more rights? I want to know what you think. So do you support Mike Buchanan? And I want you to give us a text. If you want to get involved in the conversation, please do. You can give us a call. You can jump in at any time. The number is 1850 410 494. I do want to hear from women and men, by the way. Don't be fearing me, all right? So text 53544 for 20 cents. That's the text number. Let's take a little vote first. Do you support Mike Buchanan as a party and a campaign for men and boys, an anti-feminist campaign? Do you support him? Yes, you do, or no, you don't, to 53544. I'm also going to speak as well to Roz Hardie, who's the CEO of Object. And I'll come to both of them in a sec, but I want to go to Mike first if I possibly can. Mike, your party has caused a little bit of a storm, I think, hasn't it?
Yes, I think you could say that. Last Tuesday or Wednesday, somebody did an online... Well, I say somebody. It was an online news service called BuzzFeed, and they'd interviewed me the day before, and did a piece. I mean, focusing more on the anti-feminism than the other side, but never mind. And it got more than 146,000 hits in the space of, I think it was 12 or 14 hours.
I noticed that when you featured prominently on the Journal here, which would be the most read online sort of newspaper, essentially, over here, the Journal, and you featured quite prominently on that. And as far as I know, you got something like 60 or 70,000 views on that as well. But, I mean, your policies, okay.
But it led, I should just say, it led the next morning. I was on this morning, the following day. And the feminist who was debating with me was the woman who was probably most famous for her Woman on Banknotes campaign, Caroline Criado Perez, and she had already won twice our Lying Feminist of the Month award, and on the basis of her performance on This Morning, we presented her with her third
award.
Another winner of our Lying Feminist of the Month awards is the is the woman that I'll be speaking to, or you'll be speaking to shortly.
Okay, that's Roz Hardie, and I'm going to give her the right to reply to that in a second.
Yep.
But let me look at some of your policies, for example. Let's take employment, for example. I mean, we have to look realistically that there's no doubt that women are not represented as much as men in the employment sector, are they?
Well, no, but I mean, most men, given the chance, are whole life full-time workers. Mm-hmm. I mean, I can only talk in the UK here.
That's pretty much the same. You'd be pretty sure, but it's pretty much the same.
So most full-time workers are men. Most part-time workers are women, and it is slowly changing, but it's still true. But the reason that, I mean, if you're alluding to why, let's say, in companies and so on, most of the people at the top are men. Yeah,
they call it the glass ceiling, don't they? The glass ceiling.
But it doesn't. No, it's one of many feminist conspiracy theories. And I wrote a book, in fact, called The Glass Ceiling Delusion on that very subject. Mm-hmm. The reason that there are not many women at the top of companies in particular, private sector, I'm thinking more here than the public sector, but in the private sector, the reason is well understood, and it's a fundamental difference between men and women when it comes to their approach to paid employment. Now, Dr. Catherine Hakim, a world-renowned sociologist, back in 2000 published a paper on what she called preference theory. Now, she found that in the UK, 4 out of 7 men were work-centred, but only 1 in 7 British women. Mm-hmm. So you would expect, let's say, on a corporate board, an 80-20 balance just on the basis of work ethic. And if you throw in another couple of factors as well, which I can do if we have the time, on the basis of merit, you would expect women to take fewer than 5% of major corporate board positions.
But they didn't.
Sorry?
But they didn't, clearly.
Well, it's currently heading towards, in the FTSE 100, it's heading towards 25% because the current government, albeit Conservative-led, is threatening the FTSE 100 with legislated gender quotas.
We have gender quotas in this country. I don't know whether you're familiar, Mike, but we have gender quotas in this country when it comes to politics, for example. And we only spoke to a politician last week who last year, when we had by-elections, didn't get his seat. And the reason he didn't get a seat was not because he wasn't voted for, was because they didn't have enough women. So a woman who had got less votes than him got the seat because they needed to balance the gender quota. Now, of course, I believe that is unfair.
But it's always, that will always be the case. I mean, in the UK, the Labour Party has had all women shortlists since Tony Blair's time, 97.
All right, well, stay there for a second because I want to touch on a lot of other issues as well, and I'm going to come to them too. But I want to go to Roz Hardie, who's the CEO of Object. Roz, good evening to you, and how are you?
Good evening. I'm very well, thank you.
Roz, I mean, let's be clear. The whole sexism thing, the everyday sexism, for example, on Twitter, the website, the Page 3 campaigns, the objectification of women campaigns, they seem to be really ramping up over the last 5 years. And it kind of gives the impression that every man is running around grabbing women's bottoms and calling them names constantly, which clearly isn't the case.
That's clearly not the case, and that's not something that Object has ever argued, or Everyday Sexism has ever argued, or No More Page 3 has argued. We don't think that men are sexist. We don't think all men are sexist. We've never said that. But I think it's really important when you're discussing, with people like Mike, the issues about men's rights. This isn't a zero-sum game. It's not a war between men and women in terms of rights.
Well, women, I think, have feminists not made it a war in the first place by demanding these rights?
I would argue, for example, in Ireland, there are very clear examples of ways in which women historically have been treated very badly. For example, the Magdalen laundries, for example, the way that unmarried mothers traditionally were treated in Ireland. But that doesn't mean that there aren't issues for men. I've looked recently at some stats in terms of suicide rates for young men in Ireland, and I see that Ireland's one of the highest levels across the EU. Object, we believe it's really, really sad that our sons are growing up being taught, with really narrow gender roles that mean that boys from very young age hear things like be a man, man up, boys don't cry. That pressure to be a man, not to be at all feminine, is one of the reasons why our sons grow up thinking that they can't tell anyone if they're sad, that they've got to,
But can I ask you a question, Roz? One of the main campaigns against domestic violence against women recently, and I can't remember the organisation, but we covered it, and the campaign was called Man Up. So, I mean, if we're trying to get rid of that culture where you don't want guys to feel, that they shouldn't report anything, for example, because I think something like 4 in 9 men also are victims of domestic violence or certainly, mental torture from women. There has been, these campaigns have been called Man Up, suggesting they should man up.
I mean, language can mean all sorts of things. But the words that people use can mean different things. I certainly believe very, very strongly that one of the sad reasons that men have problems around mental health is problems right across Europe at the moment, right across the world. We've got collapse in the economy. There are problems of joblessness that affect men and women. And what Mike is doing is ploughing a really, really divisive line. He's suggesting that the reasons, certainly in Britain, for homelessness is because women are grabbing more rather than because there's a housing crisis that's affecting everyone. He's suggesting the reasons for economic problems are not that, which include things like unemployment, is because women are grabbing men's jobs. It's a really sad and divisive one, and if you actually look at his agenda and what he's suggesting, there's no actual constructive suggestions about anything.
Well, let me ask Mike that.
A narrow view in terms of the types of men he's representing as well. He seems an awful lot less interested in, when I debated him recently, he was particularly rude about long-distance lorry drivers. Apparently no women fancy men for long-distance.
I did actually see that piece, yeah. But okay, Mike, in relation to sort of parenthood, right, your suggestion is, I suppose, that, children are basically have been effectively removed from nurturing in the family home, essentially. So what are you saying, that women should stay at home for the first 4 or 5 years of the child's life, which is something, by the way, the psychologist said?
No, that's not something that we would wish to make a proposal about. We think men and women should be free to make those decisions as they see fit. Mm. And when Roz says that we don't make proposals, well, in our manifesto, Niall, we have 20 areas, and I'm happy to talk about any of them. We have 20 areas, and we make proposals in all of them. So, I mean, it appears that it appears that Roz is seeking her second Lying Feminist of the Month award.
Oh, okay, all right, okay. So let me get to one of those other proposals, and I know it's one that you're going to disagree with, Roz. And I have to say, I kind of am with Mike 100%. As a man, and I have to put my hand up and say I'm a man, because I do have a penis the last time I looked, I have to say I do agree with him. And I'm going to read this one out. It says, under the current law in the UK and Wales, which is, or should I say England and Wales, which is exactly the same as Ireland, by the way, when a drunken woman has sex and later regrets the encounter, she is deemed not to be in a position to give consent, so she can claim to have been raped. A man in the same situation typically wouldn't see the encounter in that way, even if he was drunk and the woman sober. In other words, a man would probably never claim that he was raped, but B, wouldn't have a chance in court even if he did say he was raped. So the law is basically jilted towards women, isn't it, Roz?
That's complete misrepresentation of the situation. Well,
what's misrepresentation? Why is that a misrepresentation?
For anyone,
that's the law.
The idea that having sex with somebody, if somebody is too drunk to be able to consent, that person is, passed out, inebriated.
But who decides? Who decides if she's too drunk to consent? Because the thing about it is, I would say 95% of the sex that happens on the weekend in Dublin City, for example, happens with drunken people, both male and female being drunk.
I think there has to be. I think for all of us, we know there's a difference between being drunk, being slightly tipsy, slightly cheery, and still nevertheless capable of interacting with somebody and being comatose. And I think serious concerns must be had by any man or any person who would enjoy having sexual intercourse with somebody who's physically not there. You're basically having sex with somebody who's not present in that. And so I think, seriously, I think there are a lot of men who are really worried about this because of misrepresentation and red flags being flown, but some men genuinely are finding it really, really hard. Things like in Britain, there's been a big public case around a footballer called
Ched Evans, of course, yes, of course.
The Ched Evans case.
We have talked about it on the air many a night.
Sadly, unfortunately, men do rape women. A lot of men don't. Some men do.
But okay, but I asked you about this line of drunkenness, right? Okay, and let's be clear, we all have a drink, okay? Well, hang on a second, Roz.
Certainly, I have a drink.
We all do, okay? So everybody gets a bit drunk. So, and I asked this question before from a woman from a spokesperson for the Rape Crisis Centre. We had her in studio one night. She ended up walking out of the studio because she resented the question I even asked her. And I asked her, if man A meets woman B in a nightclub, and they've both had a lot to drink, and they both go back to her house, and they're both fairly hammered, and they jump into bed and have sex, and neither one it's not like you sign a piece of paper and say, do you mind if I have sex with you, and you breathalyze them first, and both have sex, and the next morning the woman says, I regret what happened the night before. It's his fault. Why is it not her fault?
There's a difference between regretting having sex with somebody but between having sex with somebody who's not consented. I think that's the difference. The difference is if somebody's not consenting because they're comatose, they're drugged, they're asleep, that is not consent. That's not active consent, and it's nonsense, the idea that it's signing a bit of paper. I think there are...
Well, if we use the Ched Evans story as an example, we all seen the video, of course, that went around as they walked into the hotel. She wasn't comatose.
Well, we've seen... Well, certainly at that video, which is currently before the Attorney General in the United Kingdom, because that video, as far as we know, has been circulated via a website that is funded by a member of the family of Ched Evans.
But it still exists. The video still exists of her walking into the hotel, linking arms. It shows her going back outside, leaning down to pick up a pizza with high heels on. You know, you would imagine she would have fallen over if she was very, very drunk. Well, the point is, I'm sure she was drunk. Roz, I'm not denying she was drunk. But the point is, she seemed to be capable of walking. Regardless of the assumptions that you're making, watching CCTV, whatever we know or don't know, that was before a court of law. As a jury, there's something called due process that's done. Okay. No, it's not the end of it, but I think there is a thing called due process where juries receive evidence, people make decisions. We also know that the vast majority of rape cases never ever go to court. Unfortunately, there are some men who rape and some men who simply cannot bear the thought of looking at themselves in the mirror and saying, if that is rape, then I am a rapist. Because if somebody's got a story that well, I can tell you now, there's loads of people who have watched that Ched Evans story and said to themselves, well, I've probably raped 3 or 4 women in my time because I've had sex with a drunken woman.
Well, in that case, for some men, if that's the case, then they should be thinking seriously about their past and seriously about their futures. But just the idea, just to get back to... Great many of us enjoy a drink. I certainly would hold my hand up. I've occasionally got drunk. There's a complete difference between, singing a song, enjoying yourself. A couple of weeks ago, I was on the train, young Irishmen from, I think they sound like Dublin accents. They obviously had a skinful. They were cheery. They were singing. They were enjoying themselves. They were having a laugh. They were just being cheery young men. That's how people behave in drunken, boisterous fashions. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with drunken people engaging in casual pickups, provided both people are consensual. The idea.
But who decides on this consent? Nobody ever says, "Can I have your consent?" It's body language. So, do me a favour, stay there, Roz, because Mike. Hang on. Just going back to the original point, and this part of this campaign. Obviously, Mike, you talk about rape and the laws of rape, suggesting that men are unfairly targeted in the laws of rape. Look, Mike, I have to say, we're all appalled by the crime of rape. It is one of the most heinous crimes. It violates a woman, but I don't know where we draw the line. You're drawing the line basically in saying that it's okay for a guy to have sex with a woman who's drunk, essentially.
No, I'm saying that it is wrong for only one of the two parties to bear any responsibility for that. This is all about about women not being held accountable or not feeling they should be held accountable. And we find that in so many of the 20 areas. So, for example, we have 7 pages in the manifesto about women sexually abusing men and children. And that happens on a considerable scale, not as high as vice versa, but it happens. You look at least in the UK, these are witch trials. That some elderly men have gone through, it's if you look at the justice system generally, if men were sentenced in the same way that women were for crimes, 5 out of 6 men in British prisons today wouldn't be there.
I mean, I'm looking at some of the text right away coming in here. So it's an absolutely crazy topic. If you're overpopulated with a country of nationalities that oppress women, you end up with conflict between the sexes. That's obviously Tara bringing different cultures into it as well. Which is, look, let's clearly say it can be a problem too. But I mean, in saying that, Mike, we have seen over the last few years obvious objectification of women, what they call objectification of women, which is the page 3, for example. Let's talk about page 3. I mean, look, I don't object to it personally. I couldn't give a damn about it. I wouldn't buy the Sun anyway if my life depended on it. But in saying that, there's guys out there that like it, but it is cheesy, isn't it? It's a bit Neanderthal, isn't it?
Well, then, anybody who finds it Neanderthal needn't buy it. I mean, it's really simple. This whole thing about objectification, I think we've sort of come to the conclusion that objectification is something invented by unattractive women who object to men finding attractive women attractive.
Well, Roz, I mean, women claim, for example, that, you know, the girl on the bonnet of the car or the girl on page 3 is being objectified. Or, well, basically what she's saying is we're objectifying women. Now, if we didn't see women in politics, if we didn't see women working in companies, if I didn't have a female producer, I'd probably agree with you. But that's not how we see women. We just see those women like that.
Yeah, well, Mike has got this bizarre theory, which is that, you know, he's created a version of what attractiveness is. Apparently, he believes that fat women are fat because we photosynthesize. It's something he's written in his book. That, again, this is very strange. Apparently, larger women are like plants.
Well, I mean, are uglier women more likely to be feminists? Is that what he's trying to say? Is he?
No, I'm saying that perhaps the idea that, you know, people find other people attractive for all sorts of reasons. What's attractive to one person is less attractive than other people. Women,
Roz, let's not beat about the bush and be politically correct here. We know what attractive is. We know what unattractive is.
People find different people attractive.
I know. But there's a world perception out there of what's attractive and what's not. Both male and female. I know I'm not that attractive. All right, I understand that. I can live with it. Okay.
Well, but let's get back to the idea that, okay, Object looked at the Sun newspaper and the way it portrays women and the way it portrays men. Page after page after page after page, the women were shown as passive, semi-clad, not doing anything, not doing any jobs, not being doctors, not being lawyers, not being footballers, not simply being things to be looked at.
Footballers, well, okay.
The single biggest, most important thing about women in terms of the way that the newspapers are portraying us is our breasts and our bums. There's nothing in and of itself wrong with breasts.
But don't women do that to themselves? If you buy any woman's magazine, which is the demographic that it's targeted towards are women, you will generally see women in their underwear, women in fashion clothes, women being objectified in some sense, and they're women's magazines.
But you also see stories which are about women achieving things. Now, we're not saying that the Sun's page 3 is the single biggest evil in our society. We think it's an example of one of the ways in which stories get told about the way that women are and what's important about us.
What's wrong with some girl, some young girl, 19 years of age, 20 years of age, who wants to go into the glamour industry and, getting her kid off in the sun on page 3? If that's what she wants to do, what's wrong with it?
Yeah, well, we believe
should we have respect for her? We should have respect for her if that's what she wants to do, shouldn't we?
We should have respect for her. I think we should have a serious question about the way that a number of people, including some very hardcore pornographers, have managed to
now we're going to pornography. Now we're taking it a step further. Why are we jumping? Why are we jumping from a little bit of titillation to pornography?
Because if you look at the control and ownership of our mass media, a significant amount of it represents pornographers who made their money in the 70s buying money, power and
I'll come to that in a second. Let me stick to page 3, which is titillation, is a pair of breasts. What is wrong with a pair of breasts? I mean, feminists are the very ones who will tell the world there's nothing wrong with breastfeeding. It's the most natural thing in the world to get your kid off and get your top off in public. But here we are objecting to it in the newspaper.
There is nothing wrong in and of itself with a pair of breasts. There is absolutely everything wrong with newspapers which regularly juxtapose stories of violence against women, of rape, of child abuse, with pictures of objectifying images of women and girls, which creates a story and creates a context in which regularly women and girls are portrayed as stories of violence and sexual violence and rape.
But when I look at page 3, I don't see any stories of sexual violence.
Perhaps you've not looked closely at...
Well, if I look at another page, I might see a story of sexual violence, of a rape, or I might see a story of a murder, but that's on a separate page.
I think, we're on a radio station. I can't show you the evidence we submitted to the formal commission.
But I don't believe there's a conspiracy there. You're suggesting, Roz, almost like it's a conspiracy to make women look bad.
You may not believe this is a conspiracy. We believe that a great deal of the British media is owned by people who made money in very hardcore pornography, and that has had an impact in terms of the way that women are presented. We're not saying that page 3 has caused sexual violence. We're saying it creates a context.
But it doesn't. There's no evidence there to suggest that page 3 or pornography causes sexual violence, by the way. There's actually evidence to the contrary.
We believe it creates a context in which violence against women is seen as acceptable, where the way that you can treat people badly, groups of people in society, is by telling one another that these people are things, that they're less human, that they've got fewer rights. That's not something that's specific to...
Well, let me ask Mike. Mike, do you believe that women have fewer rights in society? Just very quick, because I've got to go to a couple of callers here. Do you believe that women have fewer rights?
Nonsense. Well, of course they don't. You know, I go back to our manifesto. There's 20 areas in which the human rights of men and boys are assaulted by the state, or by the state's actions or inactions. There's not, in 5 years, not one feminist has been able to tell me one area where the state disadvantages women or girls.
Okay, well,
that's because you don't listen, Mike. If you actually started listening,
well, in fairness, with the greatest respect, Roz, we can't avoid hearing feminists because they're everywhere. You know, I mean, we can't avoid it at the moment, Roz. It's very difficult to avoid it. I mean, I listen now, Roz. You know, don't get me wrong. I'm all for equality in the workplace, etc. Equal pay. I'll stand shoulder to shoulder with any woman for her rights. But you know, I do believe that feminism, or should I say, extreme feminism, which is I'm seeing across the world at the moment, basically is men hating. Most of it is men hating that I am seeing. I'm seeing the most ridiculous stuff. I see it on Everyday Sexism last night, a post by this clown who claimed to know an awful lot about movies, right? Saying that he had noticed that no women were nominated in the cinematography in the Oscars this year. Now, when you take into consideration that the last 500 top grossing movies, there's only been 7 female cinematographers and 850 male ones. What are the chances of a woman being nominated?
I cannot comment on a...
But the point I'm making is stupid comments, stupid statements. I could come out with stupid statements tomorrow and say, did you realise the amount of men killed in construction every year and there's no women? What about that? That's a stupid statement. I agree it's a stupid statement, but I wouldn't make stupid statements.
Have you ever heard feminists argue that people who die in construction don't have rights? I think that is that you're creating a false dichotomy. I think, particularly as an Irish audience, I think there have been huge problems in terms of the rights of, certainly in Britain and England, Irish construction workers, mainly men, have come over to Britain and worked extremely hard, helped to create an awful lot of the economic well-being of our country. And the way that Irish people had been historically portrayed by the British media were, all the terrible stereotypes of Irish people.
Oh, yeah, drunken wife beaters.
But, drunken wife beaters, sick paddies, those stories go right the way back to, during the famine. Irish people were being presented as feckless people who had brought it all on themselves, and it would have been a terrible thing to have done.
Yeah, but when you talk about the construction industry, and I don't want to go too deep into it, many women choose not to go into construction or the construction industry. The majority of a lot of men do. Well, the majority of construction would be male.
But I think the way that powerful media has often stereotyped groups of people who are less powerful in society, and that did happen to the Irish in the 19th century and onwards. It's often, the stereotypes and the difficulties and the way that it wasn't, for example, during the famine, The Economist, the national newspaper, did a huge editorial saying that the Irish people had overbred and it was all their fault that they were starving. And that didn't cause the famine, but that helped.
Well, actually, coincidentally, we are going to be talking about the famine a little bit later on, and probably I would agree with some of what you're saying in relation to the famine. Okay, lots and lots of text coming in. I want to go to some of our callers. The number, as usual, is 1850 410 494. That's 1850 410 494. We're talking to Mike Buchanan, who's the leader of Justice for Men and Boys, a new party in the UK, and also Roz Hardie, who's the CEO of Object, and a self-proclaimed feminist. I think it's okay to call you that, Roz. I want to go to Veronica. You're in Cork. You're in Classic Hits. How are you, Veronica?
Hi, Niall. How are you?
Good, Veronica. What would you like to say? Where do you start?
Well, I suppose I've been listening to both sides of the defence, basically. But I can agree with certain things Mike says, and I can agree with certain things Roz says at the same time. So I suppose I'm kind of on the fence with both of them. The thing about it is maybe I'm probably going to get killed by women, but I do believe women, I suppose, because the rape thing, basically, I know some guys that may not have done it and still, get dragged their names through the muck and everything.
False allegations.
I can agree with him in that sense.
Yeah, okay.
But there is such a high amount of rape as well. Mm-hmm. On the other side, and there are some really evil people out there that do these things as well, but there's still not enough women in politics, I think, to be quite honest.
But they don't want to go into it. But hang on, with the greatest respect, Veronica, we've given them every opportunity in this country. We have a 30% gender quota, and they said we can't get them.
I'm not agreeing with you at all in that sense. Absolutely.
But what do we do about that?
He wants to set up his own party, he's probably going to get a lot of hassle over it, I imagine. But as I said, I can agree with both sides of it, but I think the whole Sun page 3 thing is a bit crazy as well, though, because obviously people want to do this for a living, maybe. They're models and this is what they do for a living, so I don't believe they're being victimised in any sense in that way, maybe. Mm-hmm.
But are they objectifying women as a whole? Is it kind of showing us this is all women are good for? Because that's the kind of point that feminists will make, is that what the newspapers are saying, this is all women are good for.
I kind of wouldn't agree in that sense, because there are so many other women out there that are so many powerful women out there that have gone down different careers in life. I mean, like, just for argument's sake, look at Mary Robinson, look at Mary McAleese. They were two strong women in politics at one point. They were both former presidents of Ireland. They didn't get their kit off and go onto the Sun page like they were.
Lucky for us, they didn't actually. But sorry, I couldn't resist that. Yeah, it was lucky they didn't get their kit off. Let me just go back to Mike in relation to this objectification, because this is the thing that Everyday Sexism talks about. Mike, I don't know what it's like in England, but if I'm reading Everyday Sexism, the Twitter account, it looks like it's just full of men running around squeezing women's boobs and touching them on trains. I mean, is England worse than Ireland?
I mean, it's just. I mean, most of it is. Most of it is just lies. Quite frankly, I mean, we hear some incredible stories about what men are supposed to do to women on the London Underground. These carriages. I mean, for many years now, these carriages, and London Bus is the same, have had CCTV, and I've never heard of a single case of the sort of thing that they're talking about being brought to court. And my God, if men did do those things, they would be hauled before the courts in days. I mean, so it's just nonsense.
Yeah, I mean, Roz, in relation to that kind of whole idea, you know what I mean? I mean, don't get me wrong, I wouldn't whistle at a woman on the street. I wouldn't be bothered. But in saying that, some guys will, and I did see a video online from a feminist group. I can't remember the name of them. That eludes me for the moment. But they had this woman walking down the road, and these three guys, as she walked past, looked back at her bum. She had a beautiful bum, I have to say. And they looked back at her bottom, and they were kind of ogling at it. And she was narrating as she was showing the video, and she goes, exactly with the example, I didn't ask to be stared at. And I'm going, get over it, will you? You have a nice arse, they're looking at it. So what? I mean, what's wrong with that, Roz?
Right, okay, I want to come back to Mike.
Answer that question. If a woman has a nice body and guys are walking past and they kind of go, oh, God, very nice. What's wrong with that?
Okay, if you don't see why it's wrong to leer at a woman in public, I think you need to have a serious think about why.
I'm going to go off and have a serious think about it, because I think there's absolutely nothing wrong with looking at a beautiful woman's body.
I think it depends on how people do it. People look at one another, people find one another attractive. When you're leering at people and you're making them feel afraid and you're harassing them, that's a set. You don't know that.
But if they're feeling afraid, is that not their problem, not mine? Why is that my problem?
No. Okay, I think you're playing devil's advocate, but I want to speak to Mike, because Mike Buchanan has said that women don't get assaulted on the London Underground. I was assaulted on the London Underground.
No, I didn't say that.
But Mike, you say that you don't believe that things are properly going to court. We know that there are issues around things going to court. We also know that there are a lot of women experience problems, and everyday sexism is giving women a chance to air a voice, where often historically women have been made to feel ashamed about raising things, been made to feel that they can't raise things, been made to feel that somehow or other it's your fault. You're doing your best to roll back to some romanticised vision of a past in which women were behind closed doors, in domesticated housewives, etc. This idea that there's
that is some bizarre projection on your sort. Now, the everyday sexism.
Mike, I'd like to ask you why, when you and I had a discussion in which we agreed to disagree, you immediately decided to turn me into Pinocchio, simply because I disagreed with you. Why did you do that?
No, it wasn't.
Lying.
No,
you did. That's your. I mean, it's utterly childish, Mike.
Roz,
if you can't engage with a woman,
if you stop talking, I might be able to explain. Dear God, if you stop talking, I can explain. The reason we presented. The reason. Oh, dear God.
Mm-hmm. Go on, Mike.
The reason.
Hang on, Roz. Let him answer what you said. Go on.
The reason we presented you with the Lying Feminist of the Month award is that you claimed on that television programme that the overwhelming majority of victims of domestic violence are women. Now, that is simply a lie. That was a lie. So it's nothing to do with agreeing to, it was just a straightforward lie. And so, I'm not going to apologise for calling you a liar, because that's what you damn well are.
Well, we disagreed on the statistics. I cited statistics which are all over the world.
Roz, there is no disagreement about the statistics. The statistics are really clear, and we presented 154 pages.
You and your mates have put some random statistics on the website that criticises and contradicts almost every other source: World Health Organization, United Nations, police. I have never said that there are no men who are victims of domestic violence. I told you that I had arranged and commissioned services for male victims of domestic violence, including male victims of domestic violence. No, that is true.
But would you not say, Roz, that there's a kind of denial that men are victims of domestic violence? Because here in Ireland, for example, we've any amount of NGOs, or money grabbers, as I call them, from the state, who will take money from the state, set up support services for women. There's any amount of them. There's loads of them. And we have one for men.
Well, I would like to hear Mike tell me what effort he is putting into supporting men who are victims, which I think the fact that you're a statistically smaller number doesn't mean to say you don't have rights. Absolutely not. But we're in a situation where, 400 years ago, Mike would have been burning women like us at stakes. The presentation and gross character.
You get worse.
The idea that
you
we're
really
not
get worse.
allowed. Well, in this
Roz,
I don't think Mike is burning any women at stakes.
Yeah, no, yeah.
Well, as I said, 400
we have on
years
our
ago,
website,
men like him.
Oh dear God, does she never stop? We have on our website a bibliography from Professor Martin Fiebert of University of California, with over 330 studies, which all say that women are as physically aggressive towards intimate partners as men, or more aggressive. We also recently submitted to the Home Office a 154-page report about the public bias about the anti-male bias of public bodies. So, at the end of the day, one of the leading causes of male suicide, quite apart from fathers not being able to see their children, is a virtually complete absence of support for male victims of domestic violence.
Let me go to Tara. You're in Cork. You're in Classic Hits. How are you, Tara? Go ahead, Tara. What do you want to say? For some reason, I can't seem to have her. She's not there, no? We lost her? Okay, we got her back in a second if we can. Okay, some of the text coming in. Somebody says, I think Mike is a disgusting man. To set up a campaign that's anti-women surely is counterproductive. Mike, is it counterproductive when women, maybe telling the women that your campaign is wrong and trying to correct the problems rather than setting up one that seems to be anti-women?
But it's not an anti-women site. What we're against is feminism, and specifically radical feminism. I defy anyone to find a single sentence that is anti-women in our 80-page manifesto, or any of my books, or any of my articles. Mm-hmm. It's just, the idea that we're anti-women is a shaming tactic that's designed to shut men up.
Okay, do you believe it's anti-women, Roz? Is there anything in his manifesto that suggests that the party is anti-women or is just for equality?
I don't know what's going through Mike's brain. I just want to come back very quickly to the point that was made about rape and women being drunk and then regretting it, etc.
Did you have a little bit of time during the break to research that one, was it? No, sorry.
No, I've not been researching it. I think it's really important. There will be women, and there may be some men who are listening just now, who have been raped very recently. And I think it's really important that they don't feel that they're going to be ridiculed, that somehow it's just regretful drunken sex or whatever. There's a complete difference between, probably quite a few of us on occasion.
Well, Roz, is there such thing as regretful drunken sex?
Well, of course there is, but that is not rape. There is a difference between having consensual sex with somebody and then later on thinking, I wish I hadn't had sex with that person.
Or I don't remember even having sex with that person.
No, I think there is a difference between, and it's really important for the listeners who are listening this evening to know that there are people who believe and support you, including the police, including Rape Crisis Network Ireland, and that it's important that you don't allow people, the backlash against women's rights that is represented by some of these men's rights groups, to make you feel fearful about coming forward or seeking help and support, and know that there are people that believe you. In terms of whether or not, I actually think an awful lot of Mike Buchanan's agenda is not just that. It is not just anti-women, it's anti-men. There's an awful lot of men that he doesn't seem to have a good word for either, he's not particularly enthusiastic in supporting the, he says that women don't fancy lorry drivers somehow or other, and somehow or other working class men are not attractive to women. I know a lot of women who don't particularly fancy posh men.
Well, I think the point I heard him made before is that these, I suppose, page 3 type women, or these very glamorous women, are not going to date the truck driver.
Yeah, well, the idea that women only chase men for their money, Mike just seems quite...
Well, there is women out there who clearly do chase men for their money.
People are different the world over.
Oh, no, I'm just saying, but the idea that doesn't exist is nonsense. Of course there's gold diggers out there. We've seen them. There's many gold diggers out there.
Mike strikes me as quite a bitter person, quite an angry person. They're very, very.
But I mean, what do you say, Roz, to women? And I do get texted, and I'm getting them here now as well. I don't want to be too mean to you, you know what I mean? But there is women out there who don't support feminism. They're quite happy to be the lipstick girl, if you know what I mean.
Sorry, how do you... There's nothing wrong with women wearing lipstick.
No, I mean, have you ever heard of the lipstick girl? The lipstick girl is the girl who's quite happy to go out and have her cleavage hanging out. She's quite happy with the guys shouting and catcalling at her. She likes it. She likes it. She actually likes it. I've had women say they take it as a compliment.
Right, there is nothing that objects or... We certainly don't campaign that women shouldn't go out wearing lipstick or high heels or however else women choose to dress. There's this strange setup of a stereotypical feminist that is knocked down for things that we never say and things that we've never argued and assumptions that are made about how we...
But the way some women believe that feminists, extreme feminism, make it difficult for other women because what they believe, say for example, you know, when the guy's walking down the street, he sees a good-looking girl and goes, "All right, gorgeous, how are you?" Right, he doesn't know the girl, he's just called her gorgeous. Some women take that as a compliment. Extreme feminists, on the other hand, I've seen some of them on the Twitter account suggesting that if a guy says this, I didn't invite him to pass a comment about my body. Well, I mean, the thing about it is, what's happened is the other women say, well, these feminists are kind of ruining it for us because guys are now afraid to do that anymore.
Well, okay, there's a really important difference between harassment and flirtation. If people flirt, it's about repeated unwanted approaches, which is harassment. And again, that's something that a lot of places, certainly, and I'm afraid I don't know Dublin as well as I know London these days.
Well, it's pretty much the same.
Campaigns have been done, which is about, you know, men knowing the difference. You know, chatting somebody up, flirting, that's what people do. People want to do that of a night out. If that's consensual, if the other person's responding and if they're welcoming those approaches, then... But there are some men who will repeatedly and continuously approach women who clearly are not interested in responding to that, and that's where it becomes a problem.
OK, well, stay there for a second. Let me go to Tara. Tara, sorry, I have you back there, and I'm going to come to Ryan in a second. Tara, you're in Cork, you're in Classic Hits. Go ahead.
Right. Well, I don't really understand the logic of this conversation because, I mean, the two speakers, I take it, are both from the UK.
Yes.
Now, the UK has a large number of different nationalities, and some of those nationalities have very, very oppressive views towards women. I mean, you can't walk down the street in London without seeing, I mean, every couple of steps you take, you'll see a woman with a burqa.
Mm-hmm.
I know I've had that the numerous times I've been in London. I've been in restaurants with women and they're trying to eat with burqas on them. And it's really quite disturbing and kind of creepy to be a couple of feet away from a woman and all you can see is her eyes.
That's her choice, isn't it? That's her choice, if that's what she wants to do.
I don't know, is it their choice, Niall? I don't think it's the choice of anybody, you know. I think it's a combination of cultural beliefs and religion. And and just indoctrination and brainwashing.
Okay, but I do believe that's a different situation to what we're talking about. I suppose when we talk about, well, sexism can affect everybody, but, you know, not just, you know, women who will be Western women. But I suppose what Roz is talking about is the way women are dealt with in society. Can I ask you, Tara, as an Irish woman, do you ever believe that men are over-sexualising you in any way? Do men catcall you? Do they abuse you in any way or say anything to you?
Yeah, I get sometimes I do get catcalls and things like that. But I think that in England and Ireland and most of mainline Europe, I think women are pretty much on the level with men. Well, what I'm scared of is all these other nationalities with very, very primitive and backward views towards women. I mean, look at countries like Pakistan, Iraq, Saudi Arabia. They won't even allow women to drive cars in Saudi Arabia. And I'd like to ask that lady who seems to be a feminist or have feminist views, what is she doing about this influx of people with these very dangerous radical views towards women in her own country, the enemy within?
Okay, let me ask you. It's a fair question, Roz, isn't it?
Okay, well, we're certainly not campaigning. We're campaigning against sexism, not against immigration. There are a lot of people who come in from other countries who've got progressive views on women's rights. But that doesn't mean to say we work closely, for example, with groups from different communities in Britain. We're a British-based campaign, although we do work with other organisations. We work on things like female genital mutilation alongside other campaigners. We provide support to women within communities and talk about the sorts of issues. But we also get a lot of support from men from our black and minority ethnic communities. It's not a single homogenous thing. I mean, we could stereotype Ireland, for example. I remember a young girl called Anne Lovett dying in the 80s when she was pregnant at the age of 15 in a grotto. And there's all sorts of, it's not that long ago that Irish women were put in the Magdalen laundries. That doesn't mean to say that every single Irish person is backward about women's rights. There's been some amazing women as well coming out of Ireland. So I think the point she's saying is that we've moved on from that. I mean, we don't have, obviously, the Magdalen laundries. We don't have shame if a woman is pregnant outside wedlock anymore. That's old Ireland. And, and the point Tara's made is that England has moved away from that as well, or the United Kingdom. And why would you allow it back in again? Well, the idea that we would deal with sexism by banning immigrants, I think that's
well, you're not banning immigrants. Maybe, for example, when you look at the French model, the French didn't ban immigrants, but they said, while you're over here, you don't wear your burqas in public.
Well, avoiding the question, sure.
Yeah, well, it seems to be.
I'm not sure that talking about the French issues around multiculturalism is necessarily the best model, given the current things that are going on in the world.
No, it depends on your opinion, doesn't it?
But people have got different opinions, and obviously I've got opinions that don't represent my organisation is very specifically about sexism. We don't think that. I mean, what are you suggesting? That there should be some kind of attitude towards?
Well, I mean, if you're dealing with the whole sexism issue, I suppose the point that Tara's made is why aren't you tackling the issue of a vast number of women in the UK who are, are certainly being discriminated against and are being oppressed by their own husbands, by their own families, by the very nature of their culture or religion.
What's she doing about that?
One who says we aren't doing anything about it. We're part of a broader coalition on gender-based violence, which includes very specialist services for women from specific communities. So because we're on the radio, we're not talking about everything we've ever done. But the idea that you could somehow screen immigrants to stop them coming in the country, depending on their attitude towards gender equality, is just nonsensical. I can't imagine.
I do understand what you're saying. Okay, well, I know, Tara, that'll be the ideal word. Tara, in relation to what Mike's party are doing, the Leaders of Justice for Men and Boys, his new political party, do you agree with it?
Well, I think he's a pussycat compared to what some men, their views towards women. So, I mean, as long as, it's within, as long as he's behaving in a normal, rational way and he's not oppressing women to the degree that they're oppressed in countries like Pakistan and Iraq, I don't have a problem with the guy. I mean, I personally think that women in England and in Ireland are generally, treated. There may be, isolated cases of sexism, but by and large.
You don't believe it's rampant?
No, not compared with countries like Pakistan, where women are treated as third-class citizens, or Iran. I mean, that lady you have on there, she wouldn't even be on the radio if she was living in Iran. So I don't know what she's talking about. She seems to be tippy-toeing around the issues of immigration into the UK. And I'll say this again to her. Your biggest problem is not with English men in the UK. It's with foreign men coming into the UK with radical views towards women. They treat them like
let me go to Mike in relation to that. Mike, do you have an opinion on that, or is that any part of your party policy in relation to that? Because certainly when it comes to sexism, some cultures would be sexism is more acceptable, I suppose.
I'm sorry, I'm not quite clear.
Obviously in the UK you've got huge immigration problems at the moment. And by the way, we're not far behind you. All right, so
no.
Yeah.
But different cultures treat men and women differently, I guess. But it's not something that has any part of our manifesto. It's just not.
Okay.
It's just not an issue.
All right, okay. Let me just stay there, Tara, if you can, because I want to go to Ryan in Cork. Ryan, you're on Classic Hits. How are you doing? Ryan, you agree with Mike Buchanan's party policy. You obviously disagree with Roz. Why?
Can you hear me, Mike?
I can indeed, yeah. Go ahead.
Well, I think it's fantastic what Mike is doing, and I would love to see something like that over here. In relation to what you're saying with everyday feminism, I wholeheartedly believe that everyday feminism is not feminism anymore. It is just, like you said, complete man-hating. And I'm encountered with that kind of thing just so often. It's surprising. It's pretty shocking. I don't disagree with Roz with everything she's saying. I think she's quite an intelligent woman. But there's just some things.
You kind of feel it's targeting all men, or suggesting that all men, or that men are bad, or something like that. Is that the way you feel? That
I definitely see a lot of that, and I cannot abide by it whatsoever.
Okay, because I appreciate your call, Ryan. I know it's the first time you ever rang a radio station, and I appreciate you calling in, all right, because my producer mentioned to me already. Mike, just in relation, because I've got to wrap this up in a second. Something I wanted to get around to was all these cases in the UK, particularly in the last sort of year and a half, well, I suppose since the whole Jimmy Savile expose. All these cases of, elderly superstars or ex-stars, D-listers being brought to court, and tried. What's your opinion on those situations?
I think, as I say, they're witch hunts. The current director of public prosecutions is Alison Saunders, a radical feminist, and their agendas are always around male offenders. I can't recall in my life that the Crown Prosecution Service has said anything about female sex offenders. They, as far as they're concerned, they don't exist. Whereas there's lots of evidence, we have it in our manifesto, that shows that probably something around a quarter to a third of all sex offending is done by women.
Let me go to Roz on that. Roz, these cases that have happened, and we've kind of had shows on every single one of them as the court cases happened over here as well, because, of course, we get away with a little bit more than you guys would on the radio over there because we're outside the jurisdiction. But, we've seen some of the cases, say, particularly the Max Clifford one, for example, right? The Max Clifford, of course, went down. One part of that case singled out was over a woman who was above the age of consent, who he told he was going to get her a part in a movie if she gave him oral sex. She did do that. She then regretted it later and felt that, I suppose, that he took advantage of his position at the time, and he was found guilty of that and went to jail. Many people would say, well, she was just as naive as he was, and he was just as naive as she was. Basically, the two of them played a part in that sexual act at the time, and realistically, in England, it'd be very difficult to find a jury that didn't hate Max Clifford anyway. Are those cases fair? What we're seeing in America at the moment with the Bill Cosby case is a situation where there's a statute of limitations. In other words, you say to people, unless it's a very violent crime of rape, if it's sexual harassment or if it's touching somebody's breast or whatever it is, don't be coming 40 years later and telling us about it. You've got to do it within, say, in America, I believe it's 10 years. Would that be fair to bring in a statute of limitations in?
I'm not. It's for lawmakers to make decisions about laws. I think the idea that Mike is saying, on the back of the fact that there have been great deal of revelations about historic sexual abuse, including the Jimmy Savile case, the idea that he almost seems to be jumping to the defence of historic sex abusers by saying that there shouldn't be cases which may involve lots of complicated historic evidence. But I'm not sure what you are calling for, because if you're saying that there shouldn't be, you're calling it a witch hunt, which is quite ironic, because, if you'd let me finish, I think it's interesting that I hope you wouldn't dispute that Jimmy Savile massively abused his position of power to abuse younger people, a lot of whom are women, some of whom are boys. We know that there has been historic abuse where younger people and women have been silenced. Sometimes men have been abused as well, sometimes by men, sometimes by women. The fact that sometimes voices take a long time for people to have the courage to speak out, to be believed. We also know, and it's sad, that sometimes there are false allegations. Those need to be investigated. There needs to be a due process. But people who have acted in an abusive way have a vested interest in rubbishing the voices of survivors who are speaking out. We know that's the case.
So, in other words, anybody at all who disagrees with women in relation to these particular cases are obviously an abuser themselves.
No.
But that's kind of essentially what you're saying. That if somebody speaks out loud enough, say for example in the media or in the newspapers or whatever it is, and says, "I disagree with these cases, they're witch hunts," we should investigate those people.
No, people who speak out are entitled. I think in a democracy, people are entitled to views. It's called freedom of speech. It's a really important human right. So Object believes that Mike Buchanan has a right to his freedom of speech. I believe that you have your right to express your views as a disc jockey, as a radio presenter, whatever it is you call yourself. That is about, I've got a right robustly to disagree with you. I think there is an important thing which is called due process, the way that the law investigates cases. Then how that works in relationships to sexual offences and statutes of limitations, there does need to be the rights of the accused, but we also need to know that there are significant issues in terms of historic abuse.
Yeah, but the problem is, I think, and I don't want to be speaking for Mike, is that, I had a group on the radio during the day, going back about 4 or 5 weeks ago there, and they were from Women Against Rape, I think was the group we had on. And they're demanding now in the UK that women who make false allegations or who are found out to be making false allegations should never face prosecution. I mean, that's the most outrageous campaign I've ever heard in my life.
Well, they're not speaking on behalf of Object, and Object are not part of any alliance with that view. If somebody is making vexatious and malicious allegations, that's one thing. If a case is not proven or somebody's found not guilty,
I understand, yes.
I mean, that there's a case, I think it's important that cases are best dealt with through process, through evidence.
But the problem is that process in itself, unfortunately, for both, by the way, and by the way, I certainly have great sympathy for in a case where somebody's been found guilty and a woman has been through a terrible time. But I also have great sympathy for a man who's been through a case, particularly because it is men who are being accused, and has been found not guilty, or, false allegations being made against him because his career and his life is destroyed anyway.
I think it's, it is sad, and it's important things are dealt with sensitively. I think it is also, though, really, really important that we don't forget that right across the world, the vast majority of rapes go unreported, the vast majority of sexual assault go unconvicted. That is also an issue for a lot of men as well, who can sometimes be victims of abuse, who feel absolutely terrified to tell everyone.
Okay, but just finally, Mike, in relation, because I have to wrap it up in a second, Mike, in relation to these cases, you can't deny, I suppose, that there's been so many of them. For example, particularly the Jimmy Savile one springs to mind. Now, I know the man has never had a day in court because he didn't live to tell the tale. No. But I suppose a lot of these cases are false claims, people looking for money because they were paying out 30 grand a pop to these people. And, I don't know where he would have got the time to get to all these women. But some of them have to be true.
Yes, I mean, I don't think we'll ever really know the truth about Jimmy Savile, and God knows I'm certainly not an apologist in any sense. But some years ago, people suspected of sexual offences had anonymity until and unless they were convicted. That disappeared some years ago, and the coalition agreement in May 2010 committed to reintroducing anonymity for suspected sex offenders. And they reneged on it, just as they reneged on commitments they'd made to fathers' rights groups. Mm-hmm. So basically, Cliff Richard, I guess, is an obvious recent example. Mm-hmm. And the offence is supposed to have happened, 40 years ago, maybe even 50?
This is where the police contacted the BBC before they contacted Cliff Richard.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, indeed. So the man's, so the story comes out. And it's basically a fishing expedition to see, if they can get another few people to come forward. Mm-hmm. And in the meantime, these men's lives are ruined. I mean, there's been quite a few men commit suicide after facing false rape allegations. But men are always expendable.
I mean, can I ask just finally on that note, Roz, in relation to these cases, these historic cases, Cliff Richard hasn't been charged with anything, but certainly in relation to, say, Freddie Starr, who also wasn't charged, by the way, who's very, very sick now because of what happened to him. But you've had Jim Davidson, you've had numerous amount of people who've all been questioned in relation to cases that happened 30, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, Rolf Harris, all these other people. I mean, can you really apply today's laws to a culture of 40 years ago? Because 40 years ago, it was quite... Well, hang on. Well, let me finish. 40 years ago, it was quite common for pop bands and superstars, I mean, wrongly, by the way, when we look at it now, but that was the culture at the time, to have their groupies, knocking at their dressing room doors. I mean, probably nobody asked for birth certificates. Some of these girls may have been 17 years of age, 18 years of age, 19 years of age, even younger in some cases, maybe 16. These guys didn't ask. But it seemed to be endemic in the culture at the time. Now, if that happened, we would be appalled by it, and we wouldn't even dream of something like that. As men, we wouldn't dream of taking advantage of a 16-year-old girl. But in those days, it seemed to be a very different culture. So can we apply the laws of today to something that was different 40 years ago? Is that fair?
I think, yes, we can. There was still an age of consent at that point, and it's also the fact that something was wrong. It was a long time ago. If it was widely condoned, it's still a problem.
But it wasn't condoned 40 years ago.
If something
or condemned.
If it wasn't condemned, perhaps it wasn't condemned by abusers, but it was still something that was happening. It's still something that was wrong, and I think it's important to have sort of minimum standards in terms of behaviour across generations. Just finally, I'd like to hear Mike next time he talks in terms of men's rights to housing. Let's talk about concrete plans to address homelessness problems. Men's rights to jobs. Let's look at a job creation programme that regenerates our economies for men and women. Let's have them talking about the banking system, talking about reform of the banking system, how better we could find a situation where we don't end up with economic crisis that's affecting women and men, rather than this really, really narrow, really divisive, really scary agenda, which is all pitting the whole thing in terms of a huge gender war and also stereotyping women's rights activists as if we're this somehow bunch of harpies running around confiscating other women's lipstick because they're, somehow being bad feminists, etc. That's just not the way that we behave, and that's what we do. Certainly, at the same time, what objects shouldn't be doing, what I hope nobody would want to do, is to deal with issues around men and women's equalities by somehow trying to turn Britain into an island where we're not allowing any immigrants in. If it wasn't for a lot of our immigrant workers, our economy would collapse.
Just finally, sorry, Tara, you wanted to ask Roz one question before you wrap up.
I want to ask Roz a question, and she seems to fudge to the last few questions I've asked her. Does it disturb you as a woman? Does it upset you as a woman when you see another woman of your equal with her face completely covered up in a restaurant? In your country, not in another country, in your country, in Great Britain. Does that bother you as a woman?
I think that it would be nice if women shouldn't be veiled. It's difficult for women, and there's been lots of countries where they've attempted to get rid of the veil.
I'm not talking about
Tara, with respect, she's answered the question.
It bothers me to see women looking extremely thin and extremely ill because they've been pressurised into there are different cultures that pressurise women in different ways.
No. You're fudging the question. You're being politically correct as usual. Does it bother you as a woman to see another woman with all you can see is two eye holes, right, for her eyes? You can't see her face. You can't see nothing else. Does that not bother you as another woman in your country, in the UK? Does that not bother you?
I think it probably would be better if women had the choice, and if women are, but it's not the biggest problem, to be honest. And there are women who quite comfortably wear their burqa and then at home take their burqas off and are comfortable and are free. And the idea that we should respond to the problem of equality by targeting particularly the Muslim community, I think is quite worrying.
All right, listen, guys, I got to wrap it up. Listen, Mike Buchanan, leader of Justice for Men and Boys. He's got a website there. You can check it out, by the way. Just do a quick Google on it. You'll see leader or Justice for Men and Boys is a campaign there. Thanks for coming on the air. And also Roz Hardie, who's the CEO of Object. If anyone wants to go on the air, you can have a look at her. I'm sure she has a Twitter account or something like that. You can follow her if you want to.
This is a Classic Hits 4FM podcast.